The last of her stolen rice cakes, frozen solid in her hand, was the only thing My Lin had left. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets, muffling the world and erasing her tracks almost as soon as she made them. The grey silk of her cheongsam, a dress made for the warmer climes of San Francisco, was a poor shield against the biting wind of the Sierra Nevadas. It was torn at the hem and stained with mud, a testament to the 3 days she had been running. Each step was a battle, her thin slippers soaked through, her feet numb stones she could barely command. But she could not stop. The image of her brother's face, contorted in a rage fueled by whiskey and gambling losses, was a sharper cold than any winter wind. Wei had sold her? The word still echoed in her mind, a promise of a future far worse than freezing to death on this desolate mountain. Therefore, when she saw it, she thought her mind had finally broken. A thin curl of grey smoke, almost invisible against the slate-colored sky, rising from the dense pines ahead. It was a sign of life in a world that seemed determined to claim hers. Hope, a feeling she thought had been bled out of her, surged with a painful heat in her chest. She stumbled forward, pushing through snow that reached her knees, her breath catching in ragged sobs. The cabin was small, built of dark, weathered logs chinked with mud, its roof heavy with a thick blanket of snow. It looked as grim and unyielding as the mountains themselves. For a moment, fear paralyzed her. The man who lived in such a place would be as hard as the rock beneath his feet. He might turn her away, or worse. But the thought of Wei's men, surely searching for her by now, was a more immediate terror. She forced her frozen limbs to move, climbing the 3 rough-hewn steps to the porch and raising a hand that trembled uncontrollably. Her knock was barely a whisper against the heavy wood of the door. She tried again, pounding with the heel of her hand until the jarring pain was a welcome distraction from the cold. The door opened. The man who stood there was taller than she had expected, his frame filling the doorway and blocking the warm, yellow light from within. His face was a landscape of harsh lines, shadowed by a dark beard, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no welcome. They took in her torn dress, her frost-nipped cheeks, and the desperation that she knew was plain on her face. His hand rested loosely, naturally, on the worn leather holster at his hip. My Lin's practiced English, learned from the missionaries in her village across the sea, deserted her. Words caught in her throat. She fumbled inside her collar, her fingers clumsy with cold, and pulled out the one thing of value she had left. It was a small jade pendant, carved into the shape of a butterfly, worn smooth by her mother's touch and then her own. She held it out on her trembling palm. "Please," she whispered, the word a plume of white in the frigid air. "Shelter." Only for the storm. The man's gaze flickered from the pendant to her face, then past her shoulder into the swirling snow. He saw the path she had carved through the deep drift, the tracks of a lone person fleeing. His expression did not soften, but a different kind of calculation entered his eyes. He did not take the jade. "Trouble that follows a person up this mountain," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground, "doesn't stop for a blizzard." He stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Get inside." The command was not kind, but it was a reprieve. My Lin stumbled past him into the staggering warmth of the cabin. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a healthy fire crackled and spat. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, the faint, clean scent of gun oil. A bed was built into one corner, a rough table and 2 chairs in the center. It was the sparse home of a man who lived alone and expected to remain that way. He closed the door, the heavy thud shutting out the storm and, for a moment, the world of men who were hunting her. He was right, she knew. Her trouble was not the snow. It was the men who would follow her through it. And she had just brought that trouble to this stranger's door. The man's name was Arthur Blackwood. He did not offer it, and she did not ask. For 3 days, the blizzard raged, imprisoning them in the small cabin. They existed in a space defined by silence. He was not a man for idle words. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, whether he was splitting wood, cleaning his rifle, or simply staring into the fire, lost in thought she could not guess. He gave her a bowl of hot stew the first night, the meat and vegetables so rich and warming she nearly wept. He did not watch her eat, a small courtesy for which she was profoundly grateful. He gestured to a pile of thick wool blankets near the hearth, indicating her bed, while he took the cot in the corner. My Lin tried to make herself useful, to earn her keep beyond the offer of a jade pendant he had refused. She swept the floor with a crude broom. She washed their 2 plates, 2 cups, and single cooking pot with meticulous care. Her hands, used to fine embroidery, were clumsy with such rough work, but she was determined. She found a small sewing kit in his pack and painstakingly mended the long tear in her grey cheongsam, her stitches small and even. She was aware of his eyes on her sometimes, his gaze thoughtful, unreadable. It was not the leering look of the men in her brother's gambling den, nor the assessing stare of the man Wei had tried to sell her to. It was something else, something more unnerving. It was the watchfulness of a man who missed nothing. On the 4th morning, they woke to a world of blinding white and profound silence. The storm had broken. The snow was piled in great drifts against the cabin, and the pines were heavy, their branches bowed under the weight. "We'll need supplies," Arthur said, breaking the morning quiet. "The town is a half-day's ride, if the path is clear." He did not ask if she was coming, it was a statement. She could not stay here alone, and he clearly had no intention of leaving her. He had a single horse, a sturdy, dark beast that watched them with intelligent eyes as Arthur saddled it. He mounted first, then reached down a calloused hand to pull her up behind him. The contact was brief, impersonal, but the strength in his grip was startling. She settled behind him, her hands resting hesitantly on his waist, the rough wool of his coat unfamiliar beneath her fingers. The ride down the mountain was slow and treacherous. The horse moved with sure-footed confidence, but more than once, My Lin felt a lurch of fear as they navigated a narrow, snow-choked trail with a steep drop to one side. Arthur rode as if he were part of the horse, a silent, steady presence in front of her. She could feel the tension in his shoulders, the constant alertness of a man perpetually braced for a fight. The settlement of Granite Creek was not so much a town as a raw gash carved into the mountainside. It consisted of a single muddy street lined with a dozen clapboard buildings, a saloon, a blacksmith, an assay office, and a general store that also served as the post office. Miners with faces grimed with dirt and exhaustion watched them ride in, their eyes lingering on My Lin. She shrank behind Arthur's broad back, pulling her mended cloak tighter around herself. She was an unwelcome novelty here, her Chinese features and silk dress marking her as an outsider as surely as a brand. Arthur dismounted and tethered the horse in front of the general store. "Stay close," he murmured, the command directed at her without him turning his head. Inside, the store was cluttered and dim, smelling of coffee beans, cured meat, and damp wool. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated a welcome heat. The storekeeper, a balding man with nervous eyes, nodded warily at Arthur. "Blackwood," he said, his voice low. "Storm treat you all right?" "It did," Arthur replied, his voice flat as he began gathering supplies, flour, salt, coffee, cartridges for his rifle. My Lin stayed near the door, trying to make herself small. Her eye scanned the room, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Nailed to the wall beside a notice for a cattle auction was a stack of wanted posters, the ink slightly blurred from damp. The top one bore a crude sketch of a man with a beard and grim eyes. It was unmistakably Arthur. Wanted for questioning, the words read, in the matter of the payroll robbery at Blackwater Canyon. Before she could process the implications, the store's door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air and 2 men. They were large and unkempt, their faces flushed with drink. My Lin recognized them instantly. They were her brother's men, the enforcers from his gambling tables. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had thought she had more time, that the mountain and the storm had bought her safety. She was wrong. One of the men grinned, a slow, predatory expression, his eyes fixing on her. "Well, look what we have here." The little bird flew farther than we thought. His partner took a step towards her. "Wei's been worried sick about you." And Mr. Stone, his mighty displeased. "Come on now, girl. Time to go home." My Lin backed away, her body hitting the rough plank wall. The storekeeper ducked behind his counter, wanting no part of what was about to happen. Her gaze flew to Arthur. He had not moved. He stood by the counter, his back to them, his selection of goods laid out before him. For a terrible second, she thought he would do nothing, that he would leave her to her fate. He was a wanted man himself, why would he invite more trouble? Then he turned, slowly, deliberately. He did not reach for the pistol at his hip. He simply faced them, his winter sky eyes cold and flat. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said. The words were quiet, yet they filled the small store, silencing the crackle of the stove. The first man laughed. "And who are you to say? Her keeper?" He reached for the hilt of the large knife tucked into his belt. What happened next was a blur of motion so fast and efficient it defied belief. Arthur closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He caught the man's wrist as the knife was being drawn, twisting it with a sharp crack of bone that echoed in the sudden silence. The man screamed, the knife clattering to the floorboards. Before the second man could even react, Arthur drove the heel of his hand into his throat. The man choked, his eyes bulging, and staggered backward, collapsing into a display of canned peaches. Arthur stood over them, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He had not drawn his weapon. He had not raised his voice. He had dismantled them with a brutal grace that was more terrifying than any gunfight. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. The other miners in the store stared, their expressions a mixture of fear and awe. Arthur turned his gaze back to the storekeeper, who was peeking over the counter. "Add a bottle of whiskey to my bill," he said, his voice perfectly calm. For his throat he gestured to the gasping man on the floor. As they left the store, Mai Lin walking so close behind Arthur she was practically in his shadow, the storekeeper hurried out onto the porch. "Blackwood," he whispered, his voice urgent. "You should know. That was Jebediah Stone's men you just handled. You made a bad enemy today." Arthur paused, his hand on the horse's reins. He looked at the storekeeper, and for the first time, Mai Lin saw a flicker of something other than cold control in his eyes. It was a dark, familiar recognition. He knew the name. He had known it all along. The trouble that had followed her up the mountain had just met a ghost from his own past, and now, their paths were tangled together, leading to a darkness far deeper than either of them had faced alone. The ride back to the cabin was a heavy, suffocating silence. The fear that had coiled in Mai Lin's stomach in the store had now solidified into a cold dread. She had not brought Arthur a simple problem, she had brought him a war with a man he clearly knew and had reason to avoid. She could feel the rigid set of his shoulders, the tension that radiated from him like heat from a forge. He had protected her, but in doing so, he had stepped out of the shadows and back into a world that wanted him either captured or dead. When they reached the cabin, he slid from the saddle and turned to help her down. His hands were firm on her waist, but his eyes did not meet hers. He worked methodically, unsaddling the horse and stacking the supplies, his movements precise and economical, betraying none of the turmoil she felt churning inside him. Inside, the warmth of the fire did nothing to thaw the chill between them. He stood by the hearth, staring into the flames, his back to her. "Jebediah Stone," he said, the name dropping into the quiet room like a stone into a deep well. "You need to tell me everything. Now." It was not a request. Mai Lin sank into one of the rough chairs at the table, her hands twisting in the lap of her grey dress. The story tumbled out of her, halting at first, then gaining momentum as the dam of her fear and shame finally broke. She told him of her father, a scholar who had come to America with dreams of poetry and instead found himself washing laundry for miners until his lungs gave out. She told him of her brother, Wei, who had inherited their father's meager savings and squandered it on cards and whiskey, his ambition curdling into cruelty. "He runs a small gambling den for the railroad workers," she explained, her voice barely a whisper. "He fell into debt. A very large debt, to Mr. Stone. Stone's men, they came to collect. Wei had no money. So he offered them, me." She could not bring herself to say the words, to describe the arrangement Wei had made to marry her off to one of Stone's brutal lieutenants, a man known for his cruelty, to settle the account. She was not a sister to him, she was a commodity, a piece of property to be traded. I heard them talking, she continued, staring at her hands. I took what little money I could find and the last of the food, and I ran. I did not know where I was going. Only away. Arthur listened without moving, his broad back a wall of stone. When she finished, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. She expected him to tell her to leave, to cast her out now that he knew the full extent of the danger she represented. He was a wanted man. A war with a powerful freighter boss was a complication he could not afford. Instead, he turned from the fire and walked to a small, dark wood chest in the corner of the room. He knelt and opened it. The contents were sparse, a few folded documents, a worn Bible, and a small, square object wrapped in velvet. He unwrapped it carefully and brought it to the table, placing it in the pool of lamplight between them. It was a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. The image was of a woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. She was not beautiful in the way of the painted women in the saloons, but her face held a warmth and kindness that felt real, that reached across the years. "My wife," Arthur said, his voice rough with an old, settled grief. Her name was Isabel. He looked at my Lynn, his eyes holding an ancient pain. "Jebediah Stone isn't just a freighter. That's a cover. His real business is people. He brings them in, promises them work in mines or on the railroad, and traps them in debt they can never repay. It's a different kind of cage, but a cage all the same." He paused, his thumb stroking the edge of the silver frame. "Isabel's brother got caught in one of Stone's camps. I was a U.S. Marshal back then. I went after Stone, used the law to try and break his operation. Stone doesn't like the law. He arranged an accident. A stray bullet during a raid I was leading. It wasn't stray." The wanted poster in the general store suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. The payroll robbery was likely a fiction, a charge leveled by a corrupt local official in Stone's pocket to keep Arthur on the run, to discredit the lawman who had dared to challenge him. He wasn't hiding from the law. He was hiding from a man who operated above it. "You cannot stay here," he said, his voice flat with resignation. "Now that his men have seen you with me, Stone will not stop. He will tear this mountain apart to find us both. It is not just about you anymore. It is about finishing what he started with me." My Lynn looked from the haunted face of the man before her to the gentle smile of the woman in the photograph. He had lost everything to this man, the same man who now sought to own her. In his story, she saw the dark reflection of her own. Her desperation, which had been a wild, frantic thing, began to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. She would not run anymore. "They will not look for a married woman," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The idea came to her fully formed, a desperate gamble born of a shared enemy. "They will not look for Mrs. Blackwood." Arthur stared at her as if she had struck him. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and heavy. He looked from her determined face to the photograph of his dead wife, and a storm of conflict passed through his eyes. This was madness. A fraud. A lie that would bind him to this stranger, this catalyst for all the violence he had sought to escape. It would mean giving up his quiet exile, his solitary grief. It would mean inviting a war to his doorstep. But it would also mean defiance. It would mean taking something from Jebediah Stone, shielding one more person from his grasp. It would be an act of rebellion in a life that had been reduced to retreat. He saw the strength in her, the same resilience that had carried her through a blizzard in a silk dress. She was not asking to be saved. She was offering a weapon. He picked up the daguerreotype and held it for a long moment before placing it carefully back in its velvet wrapping. "The circuit judge comes through Granite Creek in a week," he said, the words tasting like rust and regret. "It won't be a real marriage. It will be a piece of paper. For safety." They both knew he was wrong. Some things, once done, could not be so easily defined. A line had been crossed, a choice made. They were no longer a man in hiding and a woman on the run. They were allies, bound by a shared enemy and a lie that was about to become their only truth. 6 months later, spring had worked its patient magic on the mountain. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks, and the aspens shimmered with new green leaves. The hard, frozen ground around the cabin had softened, and in a patch of cleared earth, a small, thriving vegetable garden was growing, its neat rows a testament to my Lynn's careful tending. The inside of the cabin had changed, too. The floors were scrubbed clean, colorful wildflowers sat in a jar on the table, and the scent of baking bread often mingled with the familiar smell of wood smoke. It was no longer a shelter, it was a home. The piece of paper from the circuit judge was tucked away in the wooden chest, alongside the photograph of Isabel. Mrs. Blackwood was now a legal fact in the territory of Nevada. The name had given my Lynn a shield. When she went to town with Arthur for supplies, the miner's stares were different. She was no longer a mysterious, foreign woman, she was the gunslinger's wife, a position that afforded her a grudging, fearful respect. No one bothered them. Arthur had changed as well. The deep lines of grief around his eyes had lessened. He still spoke little, but his silences were different now, more comfortable. He had filed a homestead claim on the 160 acres that included his cabin and the stream that ran through the meadow below. He had filed it under the name Arthur and my Lynn Blackwood. It was a stake in the ground, an anchor in a world that had tried to set them both adrift. One afternoon, the postmaster from Granite Creek rode up the trail, a rare occurrence. He carried a single letter, postmarked from Carson City. It was addressed to Arthur. He took it with a nod of thanks and waited until the man was gone before he opened it. My Lynn watched him from the doorway, her hands covered in flour. He had spent weeks writing his own letters, sending them by telegraph from a town 2 days' ride away, a place where he was not known. He had contacted a man he once trusted, a U.S. Marshal he had served with years ago, laying out in precise detail everything he knew about Jebediah Stone's operations, from the indentured miners to the flow of illicit money. He named names, places, and dates. It was a final, desperate cast of the law against a lawless man. He read the letter, his face unreadable. When he was done, he looked up at her, and something loosened in his expression, a tension she hadn't realized he was carrying until it was gone. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet. The marshal's office moved on Stone's entire operation. They arrested him and 24 of his men. Your brother, Wei, was among them. They're being charged under federal statutes. They won't be seeing daylight again. He had not used his gun. He had not sought revenge. He had used the truth, wielded with the same precision and deadly force as the pistol he wore on his hip. He had finished it. That evening, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. The threat that had shadowed their lives for months had finally vanished. They ate their dinner in a silence that felt different from all the silences that had come before it. It was not the quiet of caution or grief, but of peace. Later, as my Lynn sat by the fire, mending one of Arthur's shirts, he came and stood before her. He held out his hand. On his calloused palm lay the small, jade butterfly pendant. He had never taken it from her, but she had left it on the mantelpiece, a silent offering that had never been accepted. "This is yours," he said. She put down her sewing and took it from him, her fingers brushing against his. The jade was cool against her skin. "My mother gave it to me," she said softly, her eyes meeting his in the flickering firelight. "She said it was to be given to the man who gave me a home." He did not reply, but he did not look away. He had offered her shelter to survive a storm, and she had offered him a name to survive a man. They had made a bargain of convenience, a partnership forged in desperation. But in the quiet months that followed, in the shared work of building a life from the ashes of their old ones, it had become something more. He had given her safety, it was true. But she, in her quiet strength and unwavering resolve, had given him back a world he thought had been lost to him forever, a life beyond the ghost in the photograph. She had given him a reason to build again. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.